On the 22nd of December 1944, General Klaus von Steinbach stood within his command post located south of Bastogne, examining the map spread before him with a deep sense of satisfaction. The American paratroopers found themselves caught in a trap with no viable escape routes available to them. His 47th Panzer Corps had successfully encircled the town from every direction, creating an ironclad ring around the defenders. Within just a few short hours, the enemy would be receiving his ultimatum, demanding their immediate surrender. The Ardennes offensive was unfolding far more successfully than even the most optimistic initial projections had dared to predict. Weather conditions remained far too severe for the Allies to deploy any meaningful air support to assist their besieged forces. Every single element of the carefully crafted plan was proceeding exactly according to schedule. Then, without warning, the first troubling reports began arriving from his southern observation posts. American armored units were advancing northward through the winter landscape. This wasn't merely a probing action or a small reconnaissance patrol testing the defenses. Entire divisions were pushing forward through conditions that, by all reasonable military calculation, should have rendered any large-scale movement completely impossible. Von Steinbach had dedicated 3 full decades of his life to professional military service. He possessed a thorough and intimate understanding of what American units were capable of achieving and what lay beyond their operational abilities. They typically operated in a methodical, cautious manner, relying primarily on overwhelming firepower superiority and complete air dominance to achieve their objectives. They simply did not execute 90-degree pivots of entire Army Corps formations in the middle of harsh winter weather conditions with only 48 hours of advance notice available for preparation. From an operational standpoint, what the reports described seemed like complete and utter absurdity. Yet the intelligence continued flowing in one report after another without pause. 3 days earlier, on December 19th, General George Patton had been sitting in a schoolhouse building in Verdun alongside Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and the other senior Allied generals present for the emergency conference. The German breakthrough assault in the Ardennes region had created a severe military crisis that demanded immediate response. The pressing question facing the assembled commanders was determining what actions to take regarding the surrounded American garrison trapped at Bastogne. Patton had boldly stated he could launch an attack northward with 3 full divisions within just 48 hours from that moment. The other generals gathered in that room believed he was either making some kind of elaborate joke or had become completely delusional about operational realities. His Third Army was actively engaged in ongoing offensive operations pointing eastward, positioned roughly 100 miles south of Bastogne's location. The road network was covered in sheets of treacherous ice, making travel hazardous. The weather conditions they faced were recorded as the worst anyone had witnessed in several decades. Patton, however, had not been joking in the slightest about his capabilities. On December 20th, while von Steinbach was methodically tightening his encircling ring around Bastogne's perimeter, Patton's headquarters staff was in the process of executing one of the most intricate and complex military maneuvers witnessed during the entire war. The Third Army's 12th Corps would maintain their positions and hold the existing line to the east. The Third Corps would disengage completely from active combat operations, execute a 90-degree turn to face north, and drive forward with maximum speed toward Bastogne's location. 3 complete divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 81st Infantry, comprising more than 130,000 men, along with thousands of vehicles and hundreds of tanks, would all be moving through a single, limited road network under conditions that made even basic movement barely feasible. The German High Command was certainly aware of Patton's fearsome reputation on the battlefield. Field Marshal Ernst von Waldheim, commanding all German military forces operating in the Western Theater from his headquarters facility near Frankfurt, had been fighting against American forces for 2 full years by this point. He regarded Patton as the single most dangerous Allied general in the field, the only one among them who truly understood mobile warfare conducted in the German operational style. However, even von Waldheim, when he received the intelligence reports on December 21st, found it impossible to believe that Patton could successfully execute such an ambitious maneuver with such incredible speed. Field Marshal Werner Kruger, who commanded Army Group B and directly oversaw the Ardennes offensive operations, proved to be somewhat less dismissive of the threat these reports represented. Kruger had extensive combat experience from fighting on the brutal Eastern Front battlefields. He understood from hard experience what sheer desperation could drive a military force to attempt against all odds. When his intelligence staff reported American columns moving north toward Bastogne's position, Kruger immediately grasped the serious implications this movement presented for the entire offensive. If Patton managed to break through successfully to Bastogne and relieve the siege, the entire southern flank of the German offensive would be dangerously exposed to counterattack. The 5th Panzer Army driving westward toward the Meuse River would suddenly find American forces attacking their vital supply lines from the south. Kruger sent urgent orders to von Steinbach: hold Bastogne at all costs and stop the American relief force from reaching the town. The ultimate success of the entire offensive operation might very well depend entirely on accomplishing these 2 critical missions. General Heinrich von Reichenau commanded the 5th Panzer Army, which served as the main striking force spearheading the Ardennes offensive. A small man of intense demeanor who had risen through the ranks based purely on demonstrated ability rather than aristocratic connections, von Reichenau was widely recognized as one of Germany's most skilled practitioners of modern armored warfare tactics. On December 21st, he found himself facing what appeared to be an impossible problem with no good solution available. His panzer divisions were driving hard toward the west, racing desperately to reach the Meuse River before the Americans could bring up sufficient reinforcements to stop them. He could not afford to pull these crucial divisions back to defend against Patton's advance from the south, without completely abandoning the offensive's primary strategic objective. But if he chose to ignore the growing threat approaching from the southern direction, Patton's forces would inevitably cut through his army's supply lines, dooming the offensive. Von Reichenau made his difficult decision after careful consideration of the impossible options before him. He would leave the siege operations at Bastogne in the hands of von Steinbach's infantry units, and whatever panzer units could be spared from the main advance. The primary thrust westward toward the Meuse would continue pushing forward regardless of the threats developing elsewhere. It was a calculated gamble of the highest stakes. He was essentially betting everything that Bastogne would fall into German hands before Patton could arrive with his relief force, or alternatively, that the relief force could be held back long enough for the Western drive to achieve success. This was precisely the kind of make-or-break decision that determines whether campaigns are won or lost. On December 22nd, Patton's forces launched their attack northward as promised. The 4th Armored Division, under the command of Major General James Caldwell, led the spearhead of the advance. Following close behind them came the 26th Infantry Division, under Major General Robert Harrison's leadership, and the 81st Infantry commanded by Major General Thomas Mitchell. The weather conditions they faced were absolutely brutal and unrelenting. Heavy snow and thick fog reduced visibility down to just a few yards in any direction. The road surfaces had transformed into sheets of slick ice that sent vehicles sliding dangerously off into ditches alongside the routes. Men were literally freezing at their posts from the extreme cold. Despite all these severe obstacles, they continued advancing forward anyway without pause. Von Steinbach's southern screening forces, positioned to guard against any relief attempts, were the first units to feel the full weight and fury of the American attack. They were completely unprepared for the overwhelming violence of what hit them. American artillery, which had earned its reputation as the most devastating in any army fighting in the war, fell upon defensive positions in concentrations so intense they completely obliterated prepared positions. American armor, supported closely by infantry units that had somehow managed to keep pace through the deep snow, pushed through defensive positions that by all standard military calculations should have held firm for days against such assaults. The reports reaching von Steinbach's headquarters grew increasingly urgent and desperate throughout December 22nd and 23rd. The Americans were not simply probing for weaknesses in the defensive line. They were not cautiously feeling out the defenses to identify vulnerabilities. They were attacking with the kind of sustained, unrelenting violence that clearly indicated they fully intended to break through completely, regardless of whatever cost in casualties that might require. Small towns that anchored critical points in the German defensive line, Martelange, Warnack, Bougainville, fell one after another to American assault forces. Von Steinbach sent what limited reserves he could spare from the siege operations south to reinforce the battered screening force trying to hold back the advance. The reinforcements proved insufficient to stem the tide. The 4th Armored Division was far from being a typical American unit with standard capabilities. It had been engaged in continuous combat operations since July, fighting its way across France and deep into Lorraine territory. Its soldiers knew their deadly business extremely well. Its tank crews possessed exceptional shooting skills. Its commanders understood thoroughly that speed combined with aggressive violence could effectively substitute for careful, methodical preparation in the right circumstances. On December 23rd, von Steinbach sent his formal ultimatum to the American commander, defending Bastogne, Brigadier General William Bradford. 2 German officers walked forward under a white flag of truce to the American lines and delivered a typed message formally demanding the garrison surrender. Bradford's one-word response, "Nuts," would eventually become famous in military history. But the true significance of the timing behind this surrender demand is frequently overlooked in historical accounts. Von Steinbach sent the ultimatum demanding surrender not because the siege was actually succeeding according to plan, but rather because it was clearly failing to achieve its objectives. He desperately needed Bastogne to fall immediately into German hands before Patton could break through from the south. The blunt American refusal to surrender meant von Steinbach now had to simultaneously take the town by direct assault while also defending against Patton's powerful advance from the opposite direction. He simply did not possess sufficient forces to successfully accomplish both critical missions at once. Field Marshal Kruger, carefully watching the situation develop from his Army Group B headquarters, began pulling units from other sectors of the front to reinforce the increasingly threatened southern flank. The Panzer Lehr Division under General Otto Brenner's command received orders to move south immediately and stop the American advance cold. Brenner was a veteran commander with extensive combat experience from North Africa and Normandy campaigns, a skilled leader who understood the intricacies of armored warfare thoroughly. However, his division had been fighting continuously without rest since the offensive first began. It was significantly under strength, dangerously low on fuel supplies, and completely exhausted from sustained operations. Brenner deployed his available forces across the likely American approach routes south of Bastogne's position. On December 24th and 25th, his Panzer Grenadiers and remaining operational tanks fought a brutal series of desperate engagements with the advancing 4th Armored Division. The Americans attacked relentlessly through Chaumont-Château and a dozen smaller villages along the route. Each defensive position cost precious time and inflicted casualties on the attackers. The German defenders made the Americans pay dearly for every single mile of ground they gained, but ultimately they could not stop the inexorable advance from continuing forward. The weather conditions on December 24th were recorded as the worst yet experienced during the entire campaign. Snow fell continuously from the heavy gray skies above. Visibility dropped to near zero in the blinding conditions. The temperature plunged well below freezing point. Under these absolutely horrendous conditions, all military operations should have been completely impossible to conduct. The 4th Armored Division attacked anyway with undiminished determination. Its columns continued grinding northward through the deep snow, its tanks sliding dangerously on ice-covered roads, its infantry fighting their way forward through massive drifts. In his command post, von Reichenau received the steady stream of reports and understood exactly what they meant for the offensive. Patton had accomplished what the German generals had considered operationally impossible to achieve. He had successfully moved an entire corps covering 100 miles distance, turned it 90 degrees to face a new direction, and launched it into sustained offensive operations under the worst weather conditions imaginable, all accomplished within the span of just a few days. It was precisely the kind of operational tempo that German panzer forces had once routinely achieved during their prime years early in the war. Now, an American general was doing exactly the same thing to them. Von Reichenau later wrote in his memoirs that this was the specific moment when he knew with certainty that the Ardennes offensive would ultimately fail, not because of any single tactical defeat on the battlefield, but rather because the Americans had clearly demonstrated an operational capability that the German High Command had firmly believed they did not possess. If the Americans could execute such demanding maneuvers successfully, they could respond to German initiatives much faster than German operational planning had assumed possible. The entire operational calculus upon which the offensive had been based rested on fundamental assumptions that Patton had just definitively proven to be completely false. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion finally broke through the German defensive lines at Assenois, a small village located approximately 4 miles southwest of Bastogne. Lieutenant Daniel Warren, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks, personally led the breakthrough assault. His tanks smashed violently through the German positions, crossed the final stretch of contested road, and successfully made contact with the American paratroopers holding Bastogne's defensive perimeter. The siege had been broken at last. Von Steinbach, receiving this devastating news in his command post, had absolutely no reserves remaining to commit to the fight. The forces that should have been overwhelming Bastogne's defenses in a final assault had been diverted southward to fight desperately against Patton's advance. The forces that should have been stopping Patton had been systematically ground down through 4 days of continuous, brutal combat. He had failed completely in both critical missions assigned to him. The recriminations within the German High Command began immediately in the aftermath. Von Waldheim, from his headquarters located far from the actual front lines, blamed Kruger for poor coordination of forces. Kruger in turn blamed von Reichenau for failing to commit sufficient forces to stop Patton's advance. Von Reichenau blamed the impossible weather conditions and the no-win situation he had been placed in by circumstances. Everyone blamed the intelligence services for their failure to predict that Patton could move with such incredible speed. But the most telling and honest reactions came later, after the war had ended, when German generals could finally speak more freely without fear of consequences. Von Reichenau, in post-war interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence, was remarkably direct and honest. He stated flatly that the relief of Bastogne had demonstrated beyond any doubt that American commanders had learned to operate at the tempo demanded by modern mobile warfare. The methodical, overly cautious American approach that had characterized their operations during the Normandy campaign was completely gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Patton had shown conclusively that American forces could now execute the kind of rapid, aggressive maneuver warfare that had previously been considered an exclusively German specialty. Von Reichenau called it a wake-up call. In his interrogation transcripts, Kruger, who would ultimately commit suicide in April 1945 rather than face surrender to the Allies, never spoke publicly about Bastogne after the war ended, but his operational orders issued in late December revealed the mindset of a commander who had completely lost faith in the offensive achieving success. After Bastogne was successfully relieved by Patton's forces, Kruger's directives became increasingly defensive in nature, focused primarily on preserving remaining forces rather than achieving offensive objectives. Von Waldheim, in his post-war memoirs, was characteristically blunt and direct in his assessment. He wrote that the Ardennes offensive had been from the start a massive gamble that required absolutely everything to go right, according to plan. Patton's relief of Bastogne meant emphatically that everything had not gone right. Von Waldheim specifically noted the remarkable speed of the American response as the single most critical factor in the offensive's failure. The German operational plan had confidently assumed the Allies would require at least a full week or more to organize any effective counteroffensive response. Patton had launched his attack in just 2 days from receiving orders. The most detailed and comprehensive German assessment of what had occurred came from General Friedrich Hartmann, who served as von Waldheim's chief of operations. In a thorough post-war analysis he prepared, Hartmann wrote that the relief of Bastogne had revealed the fundamental underlying weakness of the entire Ardennes offensive concept. Germany simply no longer possessed the resources necessary to sustain offensive operations when the enemy could respond so quickly and effectively to German moves. The panzer divisions that should have been driving relentlessly toward the Meuse River were instead being forced to fight defensive battles against Patton's forces. The precious fuel supplies that should have been pushing the advance westward were being consumed in desperate battles around Bastogne. The operational initiative, which is absolutely everything in mobile warfare, had irreversibly passed to the Americans. Hartmann noted something else significant that other German officers echoed in their own post-war statements. The relief of Bastogne had an effect that went far beyond merely tactical or operational considerations. It profoundly affected German morale at the command level throughout the army. The Ardennes offensive had been sold enthusiastically to the German military leadership as a triumphant return to the glory days of 1940, when German armor had sliced through Allied defenses like a hot knife through butter and won entire campaigns in mere weeks. Bastogne showed definitively that those days were gone forever. The Americans could now do to Germany precisely what Germany had once done to its enemies, with such devastating effectiveness. General Otto Brenner, whose Panzer-Lehr division had fought desperately to stop Patton's advance, was particularly bitter in his post-war statements about the battle. He said his division had been essentially sacrificed in an impossible mission that had no realistic chance of success. He had been ordered to stop an entire American corps with a single, depleted, exhausted division. When he inevitably failed, despite his best efforts, he was blamed personally for the failure by higher command. But Brenner's anger and bitterness were directed not at the Americans who had defeated him, but rather at the German high command that had placed him in such an impossible position. He stated bluntly that the relief of Bastogne proved beyond doubt that Germany's military leadership had completely lost touch with operational reality. They were still planning and executing operations as if it was still 1941, when Germany possessed clear advantages in mobility, coordination, and operational tempo. By late 1944, the Americans had acquired all those advantages for themselves. The operational statistics from the campaign fully support Brenner's harsh assessment. Patton's Third Army successfully moved over 130,000 men, along with all their required equipment, approximately 100 miles in brutal winter conditions, then immediately launched them into sustained offensive operations without pause. The entire maneuver, from the initial orders being issued to the successful relief of Bastogne, took exactly 7 days to complete. By comparison, when the Germans had executed their famous and celebrated encirclement victory at Kiev back in 1941 under far more favorable conditions, that maneuver had required 2 full weeks to complete successfully. The Germans had been, quite literally, out-Germaned by the Americans. There exists a photograph taken in late December 1944 that captures something profound about what the German generals were feeling during this period. It shows Field Marshal Kruger at his headquarters intently studying a map of the Ardennes region spread before him. His face appears drawn and haggard, his eyes hollow, with exhaustion and stress. He has the unmistakable look of a man who has just realized with terrible clarity that he is losing his campaign. The photograph was taken on December 27th, the day immediately after Bastogne was successfully relieved by Patton. Kruger knew by that point with absolute certainty that the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. The only remaining question was how much of his army he could manage to preserve in the inevitable retreat. Von Steinbach, the corps commander who had besieged Bastogne with such initial confidence, proved to be more philosophical in his post-war reflections on the battle. He observed that military history is filled with decisive moments where one side accomplishes something the other side firmly believes to be impossible, and those extraordinary moments often decide the outcomes of entire campaigns. Patton's relief of Bastogne was unquestionably one of those pivotal moments in history. Von Steinbach had reasonably assumed, based on all previous American performance, that the Americans would require at least a full week to organize an effective relief force. That assumption had been entirely reasonable based on careful analysis of previous American operational performance. But Patton was not a reasonable general who operated according to standard doctrine. He was a general who understood intuitively that in mobile warfare, speed is more valuable than perfect preparation. Von Steinbach said something else in his memoirs that reveals the German perspective quite clearly. He noted that the relief of Bastogne was not simply about Patton's individual skill or the Third Army's impressive performance. It was fundamentally about what it revealed about American industrial and organizational capacity on a grand scale. Only an army with truly enormous resources at its disposal could afford to execute such an ambitious maneuver. The fuel alone required to move that many vehicles that far under those conditions would have completely crippled a German corps for weeks. The Americans accomplished it and barely seemed to notice the expenditure of resources. Von Steinbach said this was the moment when he understood at a gut level that Germany simply could not win this war. The Americans possessed such overwhelming material abundance that they could routinely do things that were operationally impossible for Germany to match. This theme of American material superiority appears repeatedly throughout German officers' post-war statements about Bastogne. They were genuinely impressed by Patton's boldness and the Third Army's execution of the relief operation, but they were simultaneously awed and demoralized by the sheer scale of resources the Americans could deploy seemingly without limit. The 4th Armored Division burned through fuel and ammunition at rates that would have been completely unsustainable for any German division. The Americans simply brought up more supplies continuously. When American tanks were knocked out in combat, they were replaced with new ones within days. German tanks that were lost in battle were simply gone forever. General von Reichenau, in a post-war interview, was asked directly what he had learned from the Battle of the Bulge. He responded that he learned Germany had already lost the war in the factories and oil fields, not on the battlefield where soldiers fought. Patton's relief of Bastogne was possible not because American soldiers were necessarily better than German soldiers in combat, but rather because American industry could support operations that German industry could not possibly match anymore. Von Reichenau said this was the real lesson of Bastogne that everyone should understand. though it was a lesson that Germany had learned far too late to matter for the war's outcome. The relief of Bastogne had immediate tactical consequences across the entire front. The German offensive, which had been aimed at splitting the Allied armies apart and ultimately capturing the vital port of Antwerp, ground to a complete halt. Without secure control of Bastogne and its critical road network, the road infrastructure needed to supply the western advance remained contested territory. German units that should have been pushing aggressively toward the Meuse River were instead fighting desperately just to hold their current positions against Patton's continued attacks from the southern flank. By early January, the Germans were in full retreat across the front. But the psychological impact on the German command structure was perhaps even more significant than the immediate tactical effects of the defeat. The Ardennes offensive had been Hitler's last desperate gamble, a final attempt to somehow change the course of the war in the West. It had required stripping the Eastern Front of precious reserves, carefully hoarding fuel and ammunition for months, and committing Germany's last remaining mobile reserves to the attack. When it failed so decisively, there was simply nothing left to try. The German generals who had opposed the offensive from the very start, including von Waldheim and Kruger, felt vindicated in their earlier objections, but they took absolutely no satisfaction from being proven right. They had known from the beginning that the offensive was a desperate gamble with poor odds of success. They had argued strongly for a more limited operation with realistic, achievable objectives. Hitler had overruled all their objections and ordered the offensive to proceed as planned. Now they watched helplessly as the forces that might have defended Germany's own borders were systematically destroyed in a failed offensive deep in enemy territory. Von Waldheim, in a candid conversation with American interrogators after the war ended, was asked what he thought at the moment when he first learned that Bastogne had been successfully relieved. He responded that he thought the war was effectively over at that moment. Not immediately, perhaps, but the final outcome was no longer in any doubt whatsoever. When an army cannot achieve its strategic objectives, even when it achieves complete surprise and initial success, it has no viable path remaining to victory. The junior German officers who actually fought in the desperate battles around Bastogne had a somewhat different perspective on events. They were far less concerned with grand strategy and the big picture, and more focused on their immediate survival from day to day. But their personal accounts reveal the same underlying theme that appears throughout the German high command: profound shock at American operational capability. Lieutenant Colonel Helmut Fischer, a battalion commander serving in the Panzer Lehr Division, wrote extensively in his personal diary about fighting against the American advance. He described American artillery fire as unlike anything he had ever experienced previously, even including his service on the brutal Eastern Front. He described American armor tactics as both aggressive and highly skilled. He described American infantry as exceptionally well-equipped and remarkably determined in combat. What comes through clearly in Fischer's detailed account is his evident surprise at what he encountered. He had been told repeatedly by his superiors that American troops were soft and pampered, that they relied entirely on overwhelming firepower because they would not willingly close with the enemy in direct combat, that they were competent at defensive operations but poor at offensive warfare. Everything he personally experienced in the fighting around Bastogne completely contradicted those comfortable assumptions. The Americans attacked with impressive skill and unwavering determination. They took significant casualties and continued attacking without pause. They fought effectively at night, in heavy snow, under conditions that should have stopped all offensive operations cold. Fisher's diary entry for December 26th is remarkably brief and to the point. Bastogne relieved. We have failed. He did not elaborate further on his feelings. He did not need to elaborate. The German soldiers who survived the brutal fighting around Bastogne carried those memories with them for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews and published memoirs, they consistently described the battle as a major turning point in their personal understanding of the war's trajectory. Before Bastogne, many of them still genuinely believed that Germany might achieve a negotiated stalemate or some form of negotiated peace settlement. After Bastogne, they knew with certainty they were fighting a war that was already lost. This profound psychological shift is extremely difficult to quantify in statistical terms, but it is impossible to ignore when examining the historical record carefully. The German army that retreated from the Ardennes in January 1945 was not the same army that had launched the offensive with such high hopes in December. It had lost far more than men and equipment in the fighting. It had lost confidence in its military leadership and faith in its ultimate mission. The relief of Bastogne became in German military memory a powerful symbol of that profound loss. It was the moment when the last major offensive had failed, when the last desperate gamble had come up short, when the true reality of Germany's hopeless situation became completely undeniable, even to those who had previously refused to see it clearly. Patton, characteristically, had absolutely no patience for German excuses or rationalizations about why they had failed. When told after the war that German generals had considered his relief of Bastogne to be operationally impossible, he reportedly responded that this was simply because they were thinking like losers. Winners, he stated bluntly, do not waste time worrying about whether something is theoretically possible or not. They figure out how to accomplish it, and then they do it. Whether Patton actually said these exact words is somewhat uncertain. It certainly sounds like something he would say, and it captures his aggressive philosophy perfectly. But the quote appears in multiple sources with slight variations in the exact wording, suggesting it may be apocryphal rather than a verified historical quote. What is absolutely certain, however, is that Patton's actions on the battlefield spoke clearly enough on their own. He had promised Eisenhower he would attack within 48 hours. He attacked within 48 hours exactly as promised. He had promised to relieve Bastogne. He relieved Bastogne. The German generals who had been trained in the same rigorous Prussian military tradition that had produced Patton's personal hero Frederick the Great, could appreciate the remarkable achievement even as they suffered terribly from its consequences. Von Reichenau, in his final comprehensive assessment of the Battle of the Bulge, wrote that Patton's relief of Bastogne was a military operation that will be studied in military academies around the world as long as there are soldiers who study warfare. He meant this as a genuine compliment to Patton's achievement, though it was admittedly a very bitter compliment to give. The last word on Bastogne perhaps belongs appropriately to Field Marshal Kruger. In April 1945, as his army group disintegrated completely in the Ruhr pocket, Kruger gathered his remaining staff officers and told them directly that he would not surrender to the Allies. He had been a field marshal of Germany, one of the highest ranks possible. He had commanded entire armies in great battles across Europe. He would not end his life and career as a prisoner of the enemy. On April 21st, he walked alone into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. Among his personal papers discovered after his death was a detailed map of the Ardennes battlefield. Someone, presumably Kruger himself, had marked the map with careful annotations throughout the campaign. The route of Patton's advance from the south was traced precisely in red pencil across the map. Next to Bastogne's location, in Kruger's own distinctive handwriting, were just 2 words written in German: "Zu schnell," too fast. That was the German general's final verdict on Patton's relief of Bastogne. Not that it was impossible to achieve, not that it was merely lucky, just that it was too fast for them to counter effectively, too fast for their carefully laid plans to adapt to the changing situation, too fast for their army to survive the onslaught. In warfare, sometimes being too fast is all that matters. Sometimes speed is everything